Welcome to Law Days and Lattes, the podcast where we blend the world of law and business with a warm cup of information and common sense. I'm your host, Sidney, attorney, real estate investor, and business owner. Each week, we'll be your go-to source for legal insights, business advice, and so much more. Whether you're a seasoned professional, an ambitious entrepreneur, or simply someone seeking guidance, we'll have you covered. From navigating the legal landscape to empowering you with valuable business strategies, we'll explore the legal side of life and enjoy a virtual latte along the way. So, grab your favorite latte, get comfortable, and let's dive in to Law Days and Lattes. Welcome back to Law Days and Lattes, where we talk about building wealth, protecting what matters, and passing it on with intention. I'm your host, Sidney, founder of the Whelan Law Firm, now serving North Central Missouri businesses and families in 3 convenient locations, Moberly, Carrollton, and now in Paris. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've probably heard me talk about my philosophy of build, protect, and pass it on. At first glance, it sounds like a 3-step process. First, you build something, a business, investments, property, or income streams. Second, you protect what you've built from unnecessary risk. And eventually, you pass it on in an intentional way to the people or causes you care about. But when it comes to businesses and real estate, building and protecting often happen at the same time. Because the moment you begin creating value, whether it's a small business, rental property, farm operation, or investment venture, you're also creating risk exposure. So the smart strategy is not to build everything first and then think about protection later. The smartest strategy is to structure things correctly from the beginning so that you're protecting your assets while you're building them. And one of the most common tools people use to do that is the Limited Liability Company, or LLC. A lot of people know they should probably have an LLC, but they don't always understand what it actually does or how to make sure it really protects them. So today we're going to talk about what an LLC actually does, why it matters when you're building assets, the biggest mistakes that destroy that protection, and how to structure things correctly. So first of all, the purpose of an LLC. The purpose of a limited liability company is right there in the name. It's designed to limit liability for the people who own the business. The owners are called the members, and the idea is simple. If the business is sued and someone wins a judgment against the business, the claim should generally be limited to the assets owned by that business. Your personal assets, such as your home, personal savings, retirement accounts, should not be automatically exposed to that liability. But here's where people misunderstand things. Forming the LLC is not the protection. The protection comes from how you operate the business after the LLC is formed. If the court looks at your business and decides it isn't really separate from you personally, the court can do something called piercing the corporate veil. And when that happens, the protection that you're supposed to have disappears. So the key principle is separation. Everything about the LLC protection comes down to separation. The business must operate as its own legal entity, and that means it has its own bank account, its own records, it owns its own assets, it has its own agreements and contracts. Think of the LLC as building a legal wall between your personal life and your business activities. But if you constantly cut holes in that wall, eventually the court may decide that the wall never really existed in the first place. So let's talk about an asset holding LLC versus an operating LLC. Some business owners take protection a step further. by separating their structure into two LLCs instead of one. One LLC owns the assets, and another LLC runs the business operations. So let me give you an example. An asset LLC might own the real estate, equipment, vehicles, or intellectual property. Then a separate operating agreement runs the business itself, interacting with customers, employee, and the general public. Why should you structure it this way? Because if the operating agreement gets sued, the valuable assets are not sitting inside that entity. They are owned by a separate company. This layered structure can provide an additional level of protection for what you're building. Now let's talk about the operating agreement. This is another critical piece of the LLC structure. It's called the operating agreement. This is essentially the rule book for your business. It outlines things like ownership percentages, who has decision-making authority, how are the profits distributed, what happens if someone leaves, and what happens if a member dies. If there ever is a dispute about how the business operates, the first place the court will look is the operating agreement. Unfortunately, many people skip this step, or they download a generic template online that doesn't reflect how their business actually operates. Your operating agreement should match reality. Let me give you an example. Imagine someone buys their first rental property. They're focused on building wealth, so they buy the property in their personal name because it's quick and it's simple, and maybe they don't know any different at that point. For several years, everything goes well. The property rents consistently, and the mortgage gets paid down. The value of the property increases, and they've successfully built an asset. But one winter, a tenant slips on an icy walkway and suffers a serious injury. Now there's a lawsuit. If that property is owned in the individual's personal name, the claim may reach beyond the property itself and potentially expose personal assets. But if the property had been owned by a properly structured LLC, and that LLC had been operated correctly, the claim would generally be limited to the assets owned by that LLC, and the business owner's personal assets would probably not be at risk. In other words, the protection would have existed while the asset was being built. That's why structuring things properly from the beginning is so very important. Let's talk about the fastest way to destroy LLC protection. The biggest mistake that I see is commingling funds. What does that mean? Commingling funds. This happens when personal finances and business finances get mixed together. Some examples: paying personal bills out of the business account, or paying business expenses out of a personal account. Maybe depositing business income into a personal checking account. When the courts see that kind of behavior, they may conclude that the business isn't truly separate at all. That opens the door to personal liability. Let me give you another example of how this happens. Sometimes someone starts a small business and forms an LLC. They open a business bank account and everything starts out correctly. But then life gets really busy. One month, the business account is a little short, so they pay a business expense from their personal account. Another time, they transfer money from the business account to cover a personal expense. Doesn't seem like a big deal in the moment. After all, they own the business. But over time, those little shortcuts add up. Personal and business finances start to blur together. Then, a lawsuit happens. The attorneys start reviewing the financial records and notice immediately that the business finances and the personal finances are intertwined. And then suddenly, the argument becomes something like this. This isn't really a separate business entity. It's just the owner operating under another name. That's when a court may decide that the LLC protection doesn't apply. Not because the LLC was formed incorrectly, but because it wasn't respected as a separate legal entity. A simple rule helps avoid this. 1 LLC, 1 bank account. Respect the separation. So planning can happen anytime. Here's something important. Planning and structuring can happen at any time. If someone already owns property or already runs a business, we can often restructure things and improve the protection going forward. But the reality is this: it's much easier, cleaner, and usually less expensive to start with a proper structure from the beginning. It's much easier to build a house on the right foundation than it is to repair the foundation after the house is already standing. The same is true with legal structures. So, when used properly, LLCs become part of a much larger strategy. You build assets through businesses, investments, or real estate. At the same time, you protect those assets through thoughtful legal structures like the LLCs, proper insurance, and good operating practices. And eventually, with the right estate planning in place, you can pass those assets on intentionally to the next generation. That's the philosophy I come back to again and again. Build it, protect it, and one day pass it on. Because the goal isn't just success for today, it's building something that lasts beyond you. So, I'm Sidney Whelan, and thanks for joining me today on Law Days and Lattes. If you found this episode helpful, share it with someone who is building a business, investing in real estate, or starting a side hustle. Because the earlier you start thinking about building, protecting, and passing it on, the stronger your foundation will be. And that's what good planning is all about. So, continue to build wisely, protect fiercely, and pass it on intentionally. Have a great week, my friends.
This podcast episode contains general information for discussion purposes only. Each case is different and must be judged on its own merits. Missouri rules generally prohibit lawyers from advertising that they specialize in particular areas of the law. This show should not be construed to suggest such specialization. Nothing on this show should be taken as legal advice for any individual case or situation. This information is not intended to create an attorney-client relationship, and the listening or viewing of this podcast does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely upon advertisements.